Hey, welcome to another episode of geekoutdoors.com. And so it comes as no surprise that Android is the single most used operating system on any platform, whether it's on mobile or on desktop. All you have to do is look at such things such as these stats right here, and you can easily see that Android pretty much dominates the whole operating system marketplace. And as a matter of fact, they have reached technically 2 billion active users, and that's actually just the devices that are actually being registered as an active device, okay? And so with all of that being said, if you are a company who decides that Android will either not work for you anymore, or in this case with Huawei, that you might not even be able to use Android anymore, what are your options? And so from this recent news, we found out that Huawei has been developing its own alternative operating system outside of Android, and it's been developing this since 2012. And Huawei has been in trouble for a while now, specifically with the US government, but also other governments as well. And unfortunately, they actually rely on Android for their primary operating system. And Huawei is not a small company. As a matter of fact, Huawei is actually the second largest Android smartphone manufacturer behind only Samsung. And so there is definitely a lot at stake here if Huawei does want to remain in business in terms of, selling their products with an operating system that the majority of people around the world use. And so this kind of leads me to some other thoughts that I had about the whole mobile operating space and just operating systems in general. And this is something that I have, mentioned or talked about before. And so as we all know, when it comes to mobile operating systems, it's either going to be Android or it's going to be Apple's iOS. That's basically the only two choices the majority of people will actually think about. And also, it's pretty much the only two choices that a lot of developers and companies are going to use because of their sheer presence in the market. Now, other companies have tried to actually come into this space and either carve out their own niche or actually try to outcompete Android and Apple iOS. Big companies such as Samsung with their Tizen OS. And of course, the biggest one, Windows Phone. And then smaller ones, Sailfish OS. And even veterans such as BlackBerry. All of them could not compete. All of them were dominated by Android, okay? And iOS, it's really in its own marketplace because they don't really compete with other OS manufacturers because they pretty much have their own entire world when it comes to their operating system. So it's primarily, if you want to produce a mobile operating system device, you're primarily going to be focused on Android, okay? Because if you could get a piece of the pie by having less people use Android, then that's a better bet than trying to go against something like Apple's iOS. And the reason why this is the case is not because of the operating system itself, okay? Whenever people use an operating system, especially now in our modern age, it's never really about the operating system, the technical stuff. What it's about is the ecosystem. And this is something that's more and more being talked about and being accepted as the norm. It's the ecosystem. And so with all of that being said, the operating system, Huawei not using Android, it's really not what's important. What's important is if Huawei had to not use Android anymore, what they lose out on is the entire Google ecosystem. Because if they lose Android, then they won't have access to very important Google services. You have to be certified to actually have all these Google services on here. So, i.e., no access to the Google Play Store, okay, which is huge, and the entire ecosystem that comes with that. And so Google and Apple and every other company out there knows that it's all about the ecosystem. And so what they're planning to do and what they have been working on, and you've probably read this before, is Google Fuchsia. Okay, so where this is a hybrid of both Android and Chrome OS. And so this is truly Google's operating system because it does not use the Linux kernel or a modified version Linux kernel. It uses a new kernel, it's the Zircon. If I remember correctly, that is the kernel. And it's built basically as a Google operating system from the top down. Okay, and so the reason why they're doing this is pretty obvious, I think, to most people, is that they want to have a complete control of their ecosystem from beginning to end. And so even though the components of this operating system are open source, the majority of the control is going to be under Google. Okay, and that is something that they don't really have with Android, because once again, it is based upon the Linux kernel, and then there's other things around it. There's also Java-based parts as well, with the Dalvik virtual machine and so forth. And I still think that that's being used. I'm pretty sure it is. So anyways, by doing that, they are able to have, more of a complete ecosystem that is all Google related. And so then they'll be able to compete with Windows and Apple in a much different area, because that is why people primarily still use Apple and Windows. It's because of the ecosystem. It's not because of the technical parts, really, because the majority of people just use their internet browser. That is the majority of people. And the majority of people use services within an ecosystem. They don't really care too much about what's going on underneath. Okay, only, I think, hardcore geeks and nerds, we are really the only ones who care about the operating system underneath. Everybody else, they care about the services, the ecosystem. That's what they care about. And so, a while back, Google also had a demo right here of Fuchsia that doesn't really do anything right now. But the whole point of this is, no matter if it's Fuchsia or Android, it's going to be very familiar to people who are used to using Android, because the whole point of it is it'll be the same ecosystem. And Google has already worked on ways to actually have Android apps to run within Fuchsia. And so whenever this is released, probably it'll be announced, people have speculated, on the next Google I/O. And if it does truly run Android apps, which I'm pretty sure Google is going to be really heavy into making that work seamlessly, then for the majority of people, they're not going to notice the difference. And as I just mentioned a little bit earlier, people don't care about the operating system underneath. What they care about is having all their favorite services and programs available, and also the community that surrounds it. And so all of that is really tied to the actual ecosystem, and it's not tied to a specific operating system like it used to be back in the old days. So those are my thoughts on Huawei potentially coming out with an alternative to Android, and how I think that that's probably not going to work, because the ecosystem is what's important. And so if you had any thoughts on this, be sure to leave that in the comments area below. And as always, if you did get value out of these videos, be sure to subscribe. And if you wanted to support my channel further, you could do that at patreon.com/Geek Outdoors. Thanks for checking out this episode. And as always, if you like these videos, be sure to click on the subscribe button. And for full written content, audio content, and additional geek stuff, head over to geekoutdoors.com, and I'll see you outdoors on the very next episode.